Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Our top story: President Trump upping his tactics to counter the Chinese regime. He says an extra 50% tariff would take effect this Wednesday if Beijing doesn't pull its retaliatory tariff on American goods.
Hundreds of billions of dollars a year we lose with China, and unless we solve that problem, I'm not going to make a deal.
Taiwan's president said the island would not retaliate against U.S. tariffs. Details on Taiwan's plan to reduce trade deficit with America. Almost 100 bomb threats made against an American company seeking to revive traditional Chinese culture. What an investigation reveals. New Jersey Congressman Josh Gottheimer demands answers about a decision to let a foreign company operate the state's E-ZPass system. Details on his concerns and why the data of millions of New Jersey drivers could be at stake. And President Trump reportedly pushing for deals to mine critical metals around the globe. They're essential for making tech devices plus military weapons. We're on his move to shake China's dominance in the sector. Before we dive into today's top story, we'd like to share an important update. You can now catch China in Focus on Ganjing World every Tuesday instead of YouTube. We'll publish the link in the description box down below at that time, or you can search China in Focus at ganjingworld.com. President Trump sending a serious warning to China Monday. Posting on Truth Social, Trump wrote that if China does not withdraw its 34% retaliatory tariff on U.S. goods by Tuesday, the U.S. will slap an additional 50% tariff on China effective this Wednesday. That means Chinese imports to the U.S. would face an over 100% tariff. On top of that, Trump wrote that all talks with China concerning the meetings they requested with the U.S. will be terminated, while negotiations with other countries that have requested meetings would begin immediately. This comes as Chinese exports already face tariffs of 65 to 70% under the new U.S. levy. That's combining the new rate with tariffs imposed earlier this year and during Trump's first term. Trump said Sunday he's not willing to make a deal with China unless the trade deficit gets resolved. Over 50 countries have reached out to Trump to negotiate after he slapped sweeping tariffs on trading partners.
When you look at the trade deficit that we have with certain countries, way over $1 billion per country, but with China it's $1 trillion. And we have to solve our trade deficit with China. We have $1 trillion trade deficit with China. Hundreds of billions of dollars a year we lose with China, and unless we solve that problem, I'm not going to make a deal.
Out of all U.S. trade partners, Washington's largest trade deficit is with China. It totaled almost $300 billion last year. A Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson said Monday that threats and pressure are not the right way to deal with China. Meanwhile, Trump said he has already spoken to a lot of leaders in Europe and Asia who are dying to make deals.
But I said, we're not going to have deficits with your country. We're not going to do that, because to me a deficit is a loss. We're going to have surpluses, or we're at worst going to be breaking even.
To bring manufacturing to home soil, the U.S. placed a 10% baseline tariff on all trade partners, plus higher customized rates for those the U.S. considers the worst offenders of unfair trade. Trump noted he wouldn't back down, adding he didn't want global markets to fall, but he wasn't concerned about the massive sell-off either. U.S. stocks declined on Monday. The Dow was down 1.3%, the S&P 500 entered bear market territory, and the Nasdaq was 0.1% lower.
I don't want anything to go down, but sometimes you have to take medicine to fix something.
Other countries hit by Trump tariffs: a 20% tariff for the European Union, 46% for Vietnam, 24% for Japan, and 32% for Taiwan. Taiwan said it would not retaliate against U.S. tariffs. Washington is Taiwan's most important backer in the face of a potential invasion from the Chinese regime. In a social media post, Taiwan President Lai Ching-te said officials will try to start talks with the U.S. about having bilateral zero tariffs. Lai also said Taiwan would invest more in the U.S. and buy more American products to reduce the trade deficit. President Trump is tasking Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent with opening tariff negotiations with Japan. This comes after a phone call between President Trump and Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba Monday morning. Ishiba said he told Trump that his tariff policies are extremely disappointing and urged him to rethink the U.S. tactic. Tokyo is set to send a team to negotiate with the U.S. Trump wrote on social media that Japan has treated the U.S. very poorly on trade, adding they don't take American cars, but the U.S. takes millions of theirs. Japan's economy is heavily reliant on exports. Trump's 25% levy on auto imports and 24% tariff on other Japanese goods could deal a huge blow to the country's economy. Stock markets in Asia tanked this morning as global market uncertainty persists. Here's a closer look.
Tokyo's Nikkei 225 index lost nearly 8% after markets opened Monday. Investor panic caused Mizuho and Mitsubishi Financial Groups to both lose around 10%. China's markets also fell, and they don't usually follow global trends. President Trump, however, says he isn't especially concerned.
What's going to happen with the market, I can't tell you, but I can tell you our country has gotten a lot stronger. And eventually, it'll be a country like no other. It'll be the most dominant country economically in the world.
Hassett didn't name those countries, but we know so far Vietnam, Thailand and Taiwan have said they are willing to enter into talks.
And more on tariff developments. Oil prices sunk to their lowest level since 2021, while base metal prices in China tumbled amid the ongoing Washington-Beijing escalations. Here are the details.
Oil slid 3% on Monday to its weakest level in 4 years. Brent futures and US West Texas Intermediate crude futures hit their lowest since April 2021. Both benchmarks have lost more than 10% over the last week. It follows a large drop in oil prices Friday as markets worry US-China trade tensions could cause a recession. They fear it could see a fall in demand for crude while OPEC Plus looks to increase supply soon. Oil prices are an important indicator for Russia's financial health.
Of course, this is an indicator that is very important for us, very important for filling our budget. And of course, we are following the situation very closely, which is currently extremely turbulent, tense and emotionally overloaded.
Commodity markets, including metals, also fell. Base metal prices in China dropped, with copper on the Shanghai Futures Exchange falling 6%, hitting its lowest in more than 3 months. Gold climbed to a record peak last week, but later dropped amid a wider market sell-off. However, gold prices pared earlier losses Monday as some safe haven demand filtered through and analysts held an upbeat outlook for bullion. Investors are worried about the intensifying trade war between the US and China and its impact on demand for raw materials. Major stock indexes plunged as US President Donald Trump showed no sign of backing away from his sweeping tariff plans. Investors bet the rising risk of recession could see the Federal Reserve cut interest rates as early as May.
Nearly 100 bomb threats made against a U.S.-based classical Chinese dance group. The arts company aims to revive China's 5,000 years of traditional culture. Who is behind the extensive attack campaign? A police investigation in Taiwan now reveals a possible link tied to Chinese tech company Huawei. The tech giant has extensive links to the Chinese regime. Here's a closer look.
New York-based Shen Performing Arts is now touring Taiwan. However, several government agencies and organizations in Taiwan received a series of threatening emails. Those stated, quote, "There would be shootings or bombings if Shen performances are not canceled." As of April 4th, a total of 13 such threats have been reported. Taiwan's Criminal Police Bureau has formed an cross-agency task force to investigate. They traced the source of the emails to the vicinity of a Huawei research institute in China's northwestern Xi'an city. According to the police in Taiwan, the emails could have been sent by people related to the Chinese tech giant Huawei. They didn't rule out the possibility that they were sent from the Chinese Communist Party's cyber army based in that area. Shen is dedicated to the revival of China's 5,000 years of traditional culture. The performance depicts the ongoing persecution of spiritual group Falun Gong in mainland China that Beijing has been trying to cover up. The threatening emails in Taiwan are among about 100 targeting the company since last year, when it toured the United States and Europe.
When we got leaked documents from China, from the Ministry of State Security and Ministry of Public Security, and they spoke of a well-coordinated and extensive effort to completely destroy Shen and the broader Falun Gong community in the United States. A sort of endgame scenario. We've seen large-scale attacks in a campaign by the New York Times with no less than 10 articles attacking Shen. And we've seen horrifying bomb threats, death threats, rape threats.
On March 30th, Shen Yun received a bomb threat hours before its last performance in Claremont, California. The venue was immediately evacuated. A similar evacuation took place at the John F. Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. on February 20th. The bomb threat, just as those made to other theaters, turned out to be fake. In response to a question from NTD regarding the bomb threat at the Kennedy Center, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt condemned such actions.
Don't disrupt it. This administration will take that very seriously and hold you accountable. We obviously condemn any violence or threats of violence against American institutions.
The State Department also denounced Beijing's intimidation campaign against Shen Yun. In a recent statement to the Epoch Times, the department says its annual International Religious Freedom Report documents incidents of interference against Falun Gong practitioners and Shen Yun performing arts in many countries.
Shen Yun has 8 individual touring companies that travel the world simultaneously. This week, 4 of the 8 groups will be performing in the U.S., in New York City, University Park in Illinois, and 2 cities in California, San Diego and Northridge. Another North American city hosting Shen Yun is Vancouver in Canada. Shen Yun can also be seen in theaters in Germany, France, and Taiwan this week. Another New Jersey lawmaker is demanding answers over a $1.7 billion E-ZPass contract awarded to a company linked to China. Congressman Josh Gottheimer is questioning why the New Jersey Turnpike Authority chose TransCore over a U.S.-based competitor whose bid was about $250 million lower. TransCore is owned by a Singapore firm with alleged ties to China. With the personal and location data of millions of drivers at stake, Gottheimer warns the deal could pose a national security risk. He echoes concerns raised by fellow Congressman Jeff Van Drew, who called for a federal investigation. TransCore says it has no ties to the Chinese Communist Party. And in a separate development, Chinese logistics giant Yun Express has signed a long-term lease along the turnpike in Carteret, New Jersey. The move expands the company's U.S. footprint just off Exit 12 at a massive industrial hub. Coming up, President Trump reportedly pushing for deals to mine critical metals around the globe. They're essential for making tech devices plus military weapons. More on his move to shake China's dominance in the sector. China is hitting back at U.S. tariffs with its own levy. How should the U.S. navigate trade with China? We bring in a panel of experts to discuss. And South Korea's parliament speaker is floating a move to curb presidential powers days after the country ousted its president. More on that after the break here on China in Focus. Welcome back to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. President Donald Trump is negotiating mineral deals around the world as he works to outpace China in securing access to raw materials. On Friday, U.S. officials told the Wall Street Journal that Trump wants the State Department to secure mineral agreements. Trump also told the Pentagon to plan for refining metals on military bases and to protect U.S.-operated mines in dangerous areas. A National Security Council spokesman said that these critical mineral deals will improve the American economy and eliminate dependency on China. Zooming in on negotiations with Ukraine, the country asked the U.S. for support in its fight against Russia, offering minerals in return. Meanwhile, the Democratic Republic of Congo and Africa also requested U.S. aid to fight a foreign adversary in exchange for minerals. Likewise, part of the reason President Trump set his sights on making Greenland a part of U.S. territory is for its rare earth minerals. Denmark offered mining contracts in order to prevent the U.S. from acquiring the territory. President Trump is criticizing China's move to hit back at U.S. tariffs. What are the pros and cons? To discuss, NTD's Iris Tao is joined by William Luther, Associate Professor of Economics at Florida Atlantic University, and David Katz, Federal Prosecutor and former DOJ Attorney under President Jimmy Carter.
Well, I think that this is not the right time or the right setting for this trade war. I think Trump is destined to lose it. I think China will stand firm. China will have discipline. It's an authoritarian country. Meanwhile, Trump and these tariffs are very unpopular here in America. People are absolutely freaked out here that their retirement accounts are going down. Republicans are revolting. They're worried that they're going to lose their seats in Congress. So China realizes that they have much more of a long game to play. This will be a short game by Trump. China needs to stand up as they're standing up, and they'll see that Trump will fold. He'll probably surrender and declare victory. He'll give a bombastic speech. But the reality is, if he were very popular and if he had the support of Europe and the rest of the world, if he weren't fighting with them, that would be the time for America to stand up to China over trade, but not now. This is going nowhere for Trump.
William, your take?
Well, I think it's important to consider what the possible objectives are here. If the president's objectives are to negotiate on tariffs, right, then it looks like we're not off to a great start, right? China has matched the tariffs that President Trump has levied on China. Very different response from from what we're seeing from other countries like Vietnam, where they have offered to reduce their tariffs to zero. And so not off to a great start if the goal is negotiations. On the other hand, if the goal is to reduce the bilateral trade deficit with China, and then in that case, it seems like the president is on the right track. He's levied a very high tariff on China. Sure, China has hit back. The president probably doesn't like that. But the reality is that China ships about $3 worth of goods to the U.S. for every $1 worth of goods that we ship to China. And so if his objective is to reduce those bilateral trade deficits, if negotiation is not the goal here, then levying high tariffs on China is the policy that would deliver that outcome.
And William, in announcing the reciprocal tariffs, President Trump repeatedly criticized China's unfair trade practices and threats to our national security, especially with its ambitions in certain critical industries. First, what do you think is the best way to counter China's practices when it comes to these, and will tariffs be effective, in your opinion?
Well, tariffs are certainly effective at reducing trade. So to the extent that the concern is that Chinese technology is not secure or could potentially be compromised, then reducing trade with China is the only solution to ensuring that your technology is secure. I think the bigger issue that American companies face regarding China is intellectual property and how to keep their intellectual property secure when they deal with China. And there is some potential here that we could get some negotiations that would firm up those intellectual property issues. But again, it's just not clear what the overall objective is. So it's really difficult to evaluate the president's policies in terms of how they're achieving those objectives.
And David, it seems like you are quite critical of the new tariffs. Then what are some ways that you think would be effective in countering China's unfair trade practices?
Well, we could go to the World Trade Organization, of which we're both members, and we could complain if something were an unfair trade practice. But I think sometimes we don't really have the better of the argument. So again, we have Trump's bombastic speeches, but I think a lot of what China is doing, whether they're eating our lunch on some things or not, are within the trade format in the world. I think also we've seen the problem with China of the intellectual property and all of that sort of thing. But that brings us to the 75-day extension for the sale of TikTok by the Chinese to some American owner. And I think the reality is that TikTok has already mined a huge amount of Americans' data. And I'm not sure that even the sale is really going to prevent that. I think we have to get used to a world where the Chinese and other countries mine our data, we mine their data. I think there's just going to be a huge amount of that going on. But I do think it's very important that we not fight with Europe at the same time as we fight with China. And now we're fighting with the European Union. We're fighting with all these other countries over tariffs. And they're going to have to retaliate. Their democracies, their people will demand that they don't just, get hit. And, they're not going to turn the other cheek on this. That's all very nice in the Bible. But in reality, the electorates over there in Europe and in other democratic countries are going to demand that they don't have the U.S. just push them around, and we'll be in a trade war. The stock market was crushed today. People's retirement accounts were absolutely crushed. The Midwesterners, the people who voted for Trump, they won't stand for it. This is the end of their support for Trump.
South Korea's parliamentary speaker wants to revise the country's constitution right after a court voted to remove impeached President Yoon Suk-yeol. Some experts say his actions went against foreign influence from the Chinese Communist Party. Here are the details.
On Sunday, South Korea's parliamentary speaker proposed a revision to the nation's constitution that's to curb presidential powers. The speaker cites public support for the move. This comes after President Yoon Suk-yeol was ousted this week for declaring martial law last December.
The nation's confusion has come to an end with the Constitutional Court's ruling, but the potential for destructive conflict surrounding presidential powers still exists.
The president invoked martial law last year, saying it was to combat foreign influence from what he called, quote, communist forces and anti-state elements. After this week's impeachment, a regional expert told Fox News that Yoon's foreign and security policies stand in stark contrast to the pro-China figures long supported and controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP. South Korea's Constitutional Court unanimously upheld the impeachment on Friday. One Korean protester said this after the ruling.
This is unfair, and it is wrong. Because in a free democratic country, it's unthinkable for all 8 judges to unanimously vote for dismissal. This happened because forces behind the scenes exerted pressure or caused some kind of manipulation.
A Gallup Korea opinion survey found that over half of all Koreans support constitutional revision to change the presidential system. But the speaker's proposal to revise the Constitution has not yet been approved.
That's all for today's China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. If you have any feedback on the show or have something you'd like to see us cover, send us an email at chinainfocus@ndd.com. Would love to hear from you. For on-the-clock original news coverage, visit us at ndd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.